This music you're hearing is not by Beethoven. It's one of those delightful three-movement overture symphonies from the early classical era that we've discussed. And in a moment, I'll tell you how it relates to Beethoven, whose revolutionary, idealistic spirit would now, in 1805, be channeled into his one and only opera, Fidelio, a tale of faith, love, and heroism in the face of tyrannical oppression. And oddly enough, at this same time, Beethoven's former hero, Napoleon, was marching across Europe to settle his score with Austria, which had sent its army against France's new government a decade earlier. Keep in mind that the ill-fated Marie Antoinette of France was herself a member of the royal Habsburg family of Austria. So there was much bad blood, literally, between France and Austria. And just prior to defeating both the Austrian and the Russian armies at Austerlitz, Napoleon's troops took up residence in Vienna in late 1805, at the exact same time that Beethoven's new opera was premiered. The opera's subject matter may have been a fitting way of protesting the occupation of Vienna, but business was way off and the opera failed. But there was a bright side to this. Having put aside this opera experience now, Beethoven was freed up to return to instrumental works, a more compact, abstract means of expression. And the year 1806 saw a flood of new music, much of it in a more relaxed and genial, even pastoral idiom, possibly a creative respite from his recent heroic phase. And among these new works were the Fourth Piano Concerto, the Violin Concerto, and the Fourth Symphony in B-flat major. And it's unfortunate that the Fourth Symphony is often passed over as a weaker sister of the mighty Third and Fifth Symphonies that flank it, since the Fourth is an astounding work, beginning with its slow introduction. Yes, the same structural device that Beethoven had swept aside in his Third Symphony with those two dynamic opening chords. The slow introduction now returns in the Fourth Symphony, but with a fascinating and unexpected new sound. And the longer one lives with this music, at least in my case, the more clear things become when you step back and you take in the totality of not only the music itself, but the major influences of the day, the things that helped shape Beethoven, the man, the intellect, the seeker of knowledge and enlightenment. And by the time we get to his brilliant Seventh Symphony in 1812, by the way, the only other of Beethoven's symphonies to begin with a slow introduction, we find that he was keeping a diary, his Tagebuch, or daily book, in which we find many surprising things that fascinated him, religious, philosophic, scientific, that I am positive were embodied in an abstract, conceptual way in some of his music. And so, in my opinion, we now encounter the next example of that indefinable cosmic quality that I've mentioned in this remarkable introduction to the Fourth Symphony. For instance, what do you suppose is happening here in the music? Now, I am not suggesting that Beethoven was illustrating anything here, like he would do so graphically in his Sixth Symphony. This is much more of an elemental use of the physical sound of the music, as the space surrounding it is being marked or articulated by these short, equidistant fragments of sound. And these fragments are linked together to build phrases that define the music's larger structure. But it's all suspended in the void, it seems, so minimal, with only this F dominant seventh chord as its basis, with this lowered interval, though, added on top. that one, which gives the music so much of its color and character. But what about this? The only thing thus far that suggests the outline of a melody or a theme. Well, and I'll tell you where I'm going with this. And as so often happens, we return to Haydn in the introduction to his Symphony No. 102 that we examined. And if you haven't listened to that episode yet, please do, since the link between that work and this symphony of Beethoven's is strong, once again destroying the argument that Haydn did not influence Beethoven. Here is Haydn. Yes, it's in B-flat major, and Beethoven's is much more somber in the minor tonality. But there's the same sense of vast cosmic silence. Both works built on the same massive column of sound, 5 octaves deep in the orchestra, and on the same note, B-flat. And you remember Haydn's brilliant transformation of that serene arching motive, which became this in the Allegro. Well, we'll see what Beethoven does with his slow motive as things begin to rev up. Now, back to the music that you heard at the very beginning of this episode with that delightful passage in fifths. Where in the world did that come from? This is one of the 25 short symphonies composed by a man named William Herschel, who, like Handel, was a German composer living in England. Well, during Haydn's first big residency in London in 1792, he paid a visit to the observatory of a famous astronomer with the same name, William Herschel. You may recall that he was the man who discovered the planet Uranus and several of Saturn's moons in 1781. Well, and here it comes. They are one and the same man. Yes, William Herschel, the legendary astronomer, was also William Herschel, the composer. So obviously, he and Haydn had much in common. Now think about this. Haydn, a product of the Enlightenment, was also fascinated by science, especially the nebular hypothesis, the formation of suns and planets out of coalescing gases of swirling nebulae, a theory also promoted by the philosopher Immanuel Kant, the same man admired by the young Beethoven. And I know we're supposed to be talking about music here, but we are. And in 1799, Haydn's great oratorio, The Creation, was premiered in Vienna. It was a big event, and Beethoven certainly heard it. And it begins with a musical depiction of the vastness of the universe and the darkness and chaos that ruled. And it also begins with a vast column of orchestral sound, though this one is very powerful. And it's followed then by Haydn's musical representation of the vague, shapeless, unformed state of the cosmos. But I want to be clear about this. In The Creation, Haydn was using music to describe things as the text requires. He goes on in his music to evoke wind, hail, rain, and snow, and later birds, fish, lions, tigers. I don't think he does bears. Cows, horses, sheep, insects, even worms. So with the oratorio genre now, with chorus and vocal soloists and a picturesque text, Haydn was very obvious in the descriptive use of his music. And I'm not claiming that he or Beethoven were doing the same thing in the opening of their respective symphonies. But let's think about this for just another moment. that these two brilliant, enlightened men, Haydn and Beethoven, teacher and student, both fascinated with the concept of the formation of the universe and man's place in it. When their subconscious mind shifts into creative mode, that indefinable realm that transforms thoughts and stimuli into artistic expression, it's a very deep and mysterious thing that an artist may not even consciously be aware of, but which still resonates profoundly within him. So Beethoven is not actually describing anything in the introduction of the Fourth Symphony, and I feel very strongly that everything in his concept and design is an abstract representation of the movement of sound and matter through time and space, cutting-edge music that parallels the cutting-edge science of the day. And so now, the stasis, the equilibrium of Beethoven's universe is maintained by the steady, unalterable motion of these minute particles that we've heard, which have now shifted slightly from B-flat minor to B minor. See, they've just changed imperceptibly because of this slight shift in harmony. And this ultimately leads to a cadence in D minor, almost liturgical in tone, very interesting, over a long sustained A in the woodwinds, and there is a solemnity to this string phrase. Total calm for a few seconds as the isolated fragments now resume and they gravitate to the note A, which coalesce and expand in mass. Reverberating into the cosmos. And that grand, joyous harmonic cadence. And that stunning event, that dynamic burst of energy on a huge, dominant seventh chord that almost blinds us with its brilliance. And suddenly the tempo quadruples in speed with those dashing upward scales, which will become very important later on. And Beethoven's ecstatic, life-affirming dance bursts forth. And we all know the Fifth Symphony's reputation as a great darkness to light work. But what about this? And the exposition's main theme, as you heard, is composed of those very same formerly inanimate particles from the introduction. Very equidistant. Yes, now they're supercharged with energy. And the theme includes those lovely descending triads in the woodwinds, which will also evolve later. Everything develops in Beethoven. Everything grows and evolves. Now, am I making too much of this? Or have these shapeless elements drifting in the void been harnessed and infused, animated, ignited with the rhythm of life? It's interesting to learn that right around this time, Beethoven was involved in a rather petty dispute with a rude theater manager. And he wrote to a colleague, quote, "I will not grovel. My world is the universe." So, okay, I get it. He was upset and probably exaggerating, but it's interesting that he used that imagery. So let's quickly take a look at this amazing exposition of the first movement. There's a new linking passage, flowing and animated very softly, with the bassoon playing the main theme fragments, like so. And Beethoven here uses those diminished chords, which we'll look at a bit later. These, and this one, and then this one, not only for intensity, but also to connect us back to the mystery of the introduction. There, diminished chord. And the main theme now returns in the full orchestra. Then we move into the dominant key of F major, as in all good sonata movements, but it's not at all formulaic. Beethoven is always searching and innovating, and he uses the quick, repeated rhythm of his main theme for a transition, like so. But he then destabilizes the rhythm, shifting on to the offbeats. If we had on the beats, it would be bum, 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 but it isn't. It's bum, 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 which adds to the turbulence now with these chords. And this leads to our lively, bucolic secondary theme in F major. It starts in the bassoon, echoed by the oboe, and then the flute in D minor. And you know this evokes a very rustic sound, the shepherd's piping, yes, over sustained string chords. But wait a minute. This jolly woodwind tune. Now slow it down just a bit. Slow it down more. More. It sounds vaguely like, no, it can't be. No, please, tell me. It can't be. But it is. That somber, inanimate thing, the first primal material that we heard in the slow introduction. So this has been accelerated several dozen times, and now infused with life, it has evolved into this. But it happens so fast. Can we hear that again? And isn't this the same thing that Haydn did in number 102? The lovely arch of sound from his introduction? Transformed into, or in Haydn's Symphony No. 98, also in the key of B flat major. And this similarity, I think, is important. Like Beethoven's fourth, Symphony 98 of Haydn, starts in B flat minor with this ominous theme in its slow introduction. And this same ominous theme later in the Allegro, in the major key, is bouncing around like a gigantic calliope. Yes, Haydn and Beethoven, kindred spirits. So Beethoven's jolly reconstituted second theme is now extended into a transition, and it continually is built on the steady, repeated rhythm of the main theme. But now twice as slow, played by the strings only in bare octaves. But again, it's like a primal force of nature that gains in power, and it culminates in a robust new theme. And there's our actual closing theme, all in the dominant key of F major. So we have this new theme, followed by the closer, which is a round between the clarinet and bassoon. It's then taken up by the full orchestra, but it includes these delicate little violin interjections that shimmer like so. twice cut short by the full orchestra. And these delicate little sounds in the violins now expand into this massive crescendo, ending in that vigorous offbeat rhythm, bam, 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 like so. So, we've now entered the central development section where Beethoven continues his magic. And I'm sure you heard how he structures each phrase of the main theme with the continual use of that repeated rhythm. And these passages outline the basic harmonies of each phrase. Then they grow softer as the music is reduced to its bare organic essence now. And we're back in the void, with the repeated fragments now in the cellos. And only that little rising scale, formerly ablaze with energy, as we move from darkness to light. But now in the central development section, it's just a whisper in the first violins. And now the flute takes flight with the main theme in the key of D major, the nature key, light and airy and shimmery. And there, just as in the first movement of the third symphony, a completely new theme appears in the development. It's a lovely, elegant theme here played by the violins as an obligato, sort of over the main theme, which is in the bassoon. Hear how Beethoven's brilliant symphonic thinking has taken those little cosmic fragments from the introduction, transformed them into his main theme. But once that big diminished chord hits this one, recalling the darkness of the introduction, the music seems to lose its way and begin to disintegrate. And this dancing main theme begins to revert to its inanimate state, completely without any expression. It keeps moving, but it's like random elements of nature now, interlocking between first and second violins, and based entirely on this diminished seventh chord, like so. I mean, what is Beethoven doing here? Then it smooths out. And it finally settles here. This ecstatic sense of calm, and just a glint of that rising scale. And you recognize all of this. This is that explosive burst of light that shocked us out of the gloomy introduction. I'll play it very softly. But this is it now, coming from some vast, expansive distance. And the unexpected return of the lovely woodwind triad motive from long ago. But now there's just a trace of it. And you will hear one of Beethoven's most miraculous passages, this rapturous sense of calm in B major, suspended. and settling here. The tonic key of B flat major, distant timpani rolls, and now the ingenious use of that fleeting upward scale, which is now broken into little pieces in the violins, like so. In the string section, which will now accelerate and lead us across a magnificent plain, a panorama of sound, driving headlong into the recapitulation. Here is this entire passage. We're going to replay this entire astounding passage in just a minute. You won't hear it often, as I've said. Again, this symphony is usually regarded as one of Beethoven's weaker efforts, which I think is, can I use the word insane? The vision, the technical control, the flawless sense of structure as the music moves through time, as the music deconstructs and fragments. The elements suspended and floating in space, and then they begin to coalesce, to gather power, critical mass, as it were, the mutual attraction and repulsion of chaotic matter, according to Immanuel Kant. Again, am I reading too much into this music? Listen to it again, and you decide. And now all the materials from the exposition reappear to our great benefit. But as always in the sonata allegro form, everything stays in the tonic key, here a B flat major. And the coda to this first movement, beginning with that same blazing F7 chord that started it all, and the rushing scale. And Beethoven builds his coda on the interplay of the main theme's outline between the heavens above and the earth below, entirely based on the primal tonic chord of B flat major, and a final welcome appearance of that lovely woodwind triad phrase. So gentle amidst all the heaven-storming grandeur, and it seems to be descending from the heights, very pure, down to earth. And over it, a brass fanfare, the horn fifth, hovering above it all, that propels the music to its triumphant conclusion. Here is the coda. And so, when all is settled and we step back and take in the totality of this first movement and everything that surrounds it, the static, inanimate, soulless void of the introduction, those drifting fragments, and that inexplicable, solemn, liturgical phrase in the strings. And the fragments then coalesce into and if that isn't Beethoven's representation on some level of "Let there be light," which ignites the world and sets it dancing with joy, then I must be misreading things. Then again, when Beethoven said, "My world is the universe," maybe he really meant it. I remember when I first learned this symphony. It was in the springtime. I had just turned 15 years old, and the dreamy, wistful, romantic feelings that usually surfaced around that time of year were really heightened by this exquisite second movement, the slow movement of this symphony, and its simple, intensely yearning main theme, which is essentially nothing but a descending scale in the key of E flat major, like so. With one note that reverses, but then it continues descending. That's all. What could be more basic than that? But with Beethoven, simplicity is often the basis for the sublime. And E flat major is now the tonic key of this movement. And you heard the lovely melody descending, and then it begins to ascend into the dominant key of B flat. But you may have also noticed that the texture wasn't entirely smooth and lyrical. The second violins were keeping time in a way, with a gentle but insistent clipped rhythm. Sort of a pulsation. More on that in a bit. Still, the overall character is so lovely. In fact, it recalls the popular Viennese serenade genre, which flourished under Mozart. The serenade for wind ensemble, so fashionable to accompany a late-night moonlit rendezvous under the balcony in the garden and whatnot. So often, serenades were in the mellow key of E flat major, which suited the wind instruments very well. For instance, this exquisite serenade by Mozart, which also begins with a descending scale melody in E flat major. But Beethoven's exquisite lyricism has a certain intensity to it, since that clipped rhythm that I mentioned is an essential part of the music. In fact, this second movement begins with an introductory measure of this rhythmic motive alone. And as the gorgeous main theme reaches its climax, it is crowned by this same rhythm, now played by the full orchestra, complete with trumpets and timpani and sounding very martial and majestic. So we have an unusual combination of exquisite romantic beauty and this insistent martial ceremonial fanfare motive. And that same martial rhythm now softens, and it almost breathes or pulsates along with our lovely melody. What is additionally significant here is that this martial rhythm has its own counterpart, like the opposite side of the coin. It's a very florid figure that's usually based on the tonic triad of E flat major, like so, which also crowns the main theme with its grandiose flourishes. This passage is very unusual. It's thrilling in the way that it sweeps you along with unison trumpets and timpani marking each beat. Yet it seems a little incongruous in the midst of this very serene and gentle music. And as the main theme continues to unfold, this florid motif develops right along with it. It embellishes the theme in the woodwinds like so. It's still very smooth and legato, but then it switches to a much livelier staccato. So we have this serene, lyrical main theme in combination with the martial rhythm, ba-bum, bum, ba-bum, which then switches to this luxuriant, flowing figure. And all of this creates a continual sense of motion and rhythmic vitality in the music. Here is the entire passage. And we've arrived in the dominant key of B flat major. So this may be a sonata form of some sort. We'll see what happens. But we now encounter what I regard as Beethoven's most overtly romantic passage in any of his symphonies, along with the slow movement Brook scene of the Pastoral Symphony. But that work is a specifically descriptive work, whereas this new secondary theme we've just reached in the Fourth Symphony is uniquely beautiful in its sound alone, as pure music. And just as the main theme is built on a descending scale, this new theme, played by the clarinet, rises slowly and mysteriously over the warm, hushed string accompaniment. And the intensity of the string sound, which you'll hear in the recording in just a moment. It's largely due to Beethoven's use of the diminished seventh chord, which I've mentioned so often. So this is a good time to take the plunge. Okay, it's actually very simple. You take your dominant seventh chord that we've heard so often, this. It's what the Beatles do in Twist and Shout. Your dominant seventh chord, yes? Yes. And it's a seventh chord because the distance between the bottom note and the top note is 7 notes. 1, 2, okay. And now you will lower, for the diminished chord, you will lower, you will make smaller, you will diminish the intervals between each of the notes. You keep the lowest note the same, the A is the same, but then you lower each of the other notes by a half step. So this note becomes this note becomes this, and the top note becomes this. The intervals between the top three notes are diminished by a half step to produce this familiar and very telling sound. And with Beethoven's secondary theme now, you add the tonic B flat in the bass. Wow, and you sense the magical effect that this chord produces. Now, these diminished chords have been around for ages, but they really came into their own during the new openly expressive idiom of the Romantic era. And they are mainly used in two ways. First, to add extra intensity to a lyrical melody, such as this tune, which we all know. There's your diminished seventh chord, and you can go the next one higher, like so. But also, as the Romantic style became more invested in literature, in fantasy and Gothic, horror and legends and supernatural, think of Mary Shelley and E.T.A. Hoffman at the same time, the diminished chord became very effective in music and eventually very overused to convey tension and fear and mystery, all sorts of creepy things, and storms and tempest. Franz Liszt would have been lost without the diminished seventh chord. Etc. And now in the slow introduction of the Beethoven Fourth Symphony, we heard this. Here, there's your diminished seventh chord. And we'll hear much more of this chord in the scherzo movement. But here, in the gorgeous secondary theme in the second movement, the rising clarinet theme, the diminished seventh is used for maximum expressive effect, as we will hear. And it's followed by a third theme, a closing theme that starts as a simple bassoon duet, but is delicately accompanied by both the florid figure in the strings and at the same time the opening martial motive is heard very softly in the basses. So this bassoon duet theme is accompanied by both of these contrasting figures simultaneously. But let's back up now to the exquisite second theme, the clarinet rising out of the cushion of strings. And their diminished chord in the strings is ingeniously voiced by Beethoven as each string section rises in an arpeggio and then settles on one of the notes of the diminished chord, like so. It starts with the cellos. They rise in an arpeggio, and they settle here, and the violas then rise in an arpeggio, and they settle here. The second violins then rise, and they settle here, and all of them are sustaining their notes. Then the first violin rises and settles here, hovering, sustaining. So you have this amazing stream of sound that just shimmers in the background as the clarinet emerges from it. And as the clarinet continues its melody, it's only the violins that accompany very delicately, like so. Lots of details here, I know, but bear in mind that this exquisitely wrought music has largely been ignored. The Beethoven Fourth Symphony is the least performed and least known of his 9 symphonies. So let's start with the clarinet theme now, and the diminished chord rising in the strings. Everybody knows Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. Maybe this is Beethoven's dreamy moonlit symphony. The clarinet rises, and the strings hover in the background. Now the delicate violin accompaniment. And the accompaniment now intensifies with the diminished 7th chord. And now the closing theme, the bassoon duet. And the florid motive is in the strings, and the martial motive below in the basses. And and now a big dominant seventh chord, and the martial motive with trumpets and timpani. And the martial motive in the second violins, and the welcome return of the main theme. And notice that all of these accompanying motives, they all provide a continuous sense of motion, whether it's the martial figure or the florid figure. And sometimes it's staccato, the delicate interplay of violins. They all create this underlying organic flow upon which the music seems to float. So in terms of structure, we have the descending main theme, then a move to the dominant key of B flat for the lovely secondary theme in the clarinet, the third closing theme, the bassoon duet, and now there's a return to the main theme in the tonic key in E flat. So it's sort of like a rondo with A returning. And once again, we hear a full version of the martial motive, which always seems to intrude a bit on the serenity of the music. But this time, it will lead to this. And that was a very powerful and rather tragic-sounding restatement of the main theme in the minor key and with the basic outline of the theme, that descending scale very clearly audible. And the music fades, and it resolves into the key of G flat major. And after that drama and darkness, well, I'd say that we are most likely in the central development section of this movement. And that florid motive from before is now heard in a gentle improvisatory cadenza for the first and second violins. And Beethoven reduces his orchestra to a bare minimum, with the martial motive, a solo bassoon, emerging from the silence. The main theme now is descending in the clarinet, and the martial motive distant now in cellos and basses. The main theme now continues in the clarinet, and E flat minor now shifts to E flat major, and this brief development section ends with the return of our lovely main theme in a graceful, embellished version by the flute. And the rhythmic pulse, the ba-dum-bum motive, will now be provided by the violins. Which replaces the more martial motive from the beginning. And this recapitulation is introduced by the two French horns, with the martial figure very softly in the timpani, sounding as if they are heralding the return of the main theme from afar. There is something totally enchanting about this music that captures another major element of the Romantic era, the fascination with the ancient world of legend, the age of chivalry and knighthood, which was largely a reaction against the spread of industrialization at the time. There was also a renewed sense of man's profound relationship with nature, which would inspire another of Beethoven's magnificent symphonies. And this gorgeous second movement will essentially retrace its steps now in the recapitulation, giving us another opportunity to experience the wonders of this music, but now with a slightly different character in the tonic key of E flat major. And there is a brief coda, preceded by the florid motive that gracefully winds its way through the string section, ending in the cellos. in a calm, almost chorale-like return of the main theme with no underlying rhythm, the only time in the movement that it doesn't have rhythmic vitality underneath. And there's a series of miniature cadenzas, of arpeggios for solo wind instruments. It's very pastoral in nature, which grow and expand into a grandiose chorale-like cadence. And a final timpani fanfare from afar. So here are the last few minutes of the second movement, beginning with the return of the dreamy secondary theme in the clarinet, rising from the warm and luminous string choir and their diminished chord. And there is indeed an unmistakable nature quality to this passage, shepherd's calls and bird song, not literally illustrated, but all through this movement, the continuous sense of motion, whether it's the regal martial motive, often sounding like a fanfare, or the gentle flowing motive. Beethoven masterfully combines all of these elements into a magical, mythical sort of fantasy cum serenade that is as overtly romantic in the truest sense of the word as anything that he or anyone else ever wrote. Well, he's done it again. Beethoven labels the third movement scherzo as a minuetto, and who knows why, because this is possibly the boldest and most raucous of any of his symphonic scherzi. You recall the rhythmic device, the hemiola, that we discussed in the Third Symphony? Again, it occurs in music with 3 beats to the measure, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. So say that we take 2 measures or bars of very quick triple time, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and the accent naturally falls on the first beat of each bar, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So that's 2 groups of 3 beats. But these 6 very fast beats, da 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 da, can also be divided into groups of 2, with the accents on every 2 beats. So we would now have 3 groups of 2 beats, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. It's simple mathematics. You got 6 beats, you can divide them into 3, you can divide them into 2. And the hemiola pattern shifts between both of these groupings, usually at a very quick tempo. So back in the Eroica Symphony's first movement, Beethoven used the hemiola to disrupt and destabilize the normal flow of the music. Here, in the Fourth Symphony's scherzo, the hemiola is the normal. So what in the world just happened there in the first 20 measures, which last 12 seconds? Again, it's unbelievable how little recognition there is for this symphony's amazing, innovative qualities. What we just heard was a raucous, supercharged dance that begins with a major Hemiola event. 3 rapid groups of 2 notes in the tonic key of B flat, then immediately shifting into groups of 3 notes in the dominant chord. Then that's the first 4 measures. But then suddenly the music shifts into the minor key with an eerie arpeggio outlining a diminished 7th chord. It ascends in the clarinet and bassoon, then it descends in the strings. Then another diminished 7th, answered by the strings, which then snaps itself out of the gloom with 4 bars of Hemiola. What? Ending now with 4 bars back in the normal triple rhythm, a jolly triad theme in the dominant key of F major. Well, I'm glad he pulled it all together there at the very end. This is a lot to take in a mere 12 seconds, especially back in 1807. So here it is again, the opening 20 measures with its repeat. The conception and organization of these seemingly chaotic rhythmic groupings for full orchestra is astounding. What's more amazing is that these shadowy diminished arpeggios, in my opinion, are Beethoven's connecting this riotous dance with the mysterious gloom of the first movement's introduction, that cosmic nothingness from which everything has emerged. It has to be. In Haydn's great Symphony 102, this sort of cosmic connection is maintained right until the end of the work. So we have this amazing opening 20-measure section that encapsulates the entire musical content of this scherzo. A rowdy, rambunctious dance called a minuet, wild fluctuations in the rhythmic structure, the sudden appearance of those ghostly, fleeting arpeggios that stop the music dead in its tracks, and then 4 robust closing measures that chase the blues away. Here it is again. Now, the formal scherzo and minuet structure requires a second section, a continuation that's longer and more complex than the first section. But it's very well balanced because the first section returns, and then the trio section follows that. So this much longer section now begins. Suddenly we're in the key of D flat major, with a much lighter version of the opening theme played by the first violins with the flute an octave higher. All the Hemiola figures are there, and they're extended by the second violins and violas scampering around. Now, before we hear this entire second section, I will play just the harmonic basis, the underlying progression of chords that the music is built upon. Starting with the D flat major that we're in, here's where Beethoven takes us. Then the return of the raucous opening. So this whole second section functions like a mini development and a recapitulation. Beethoven extracts the main motive of the opening theme, moves us to remote harmonic regions, as you just heard, and then he settles on the F7, the dominant chord, leading to the recapitulation of the opening. So here is this entire second section. Beethoven will, of course, vary this little recap in many fascinating ways, especially those eerie, diminished arpeggios that glide up and down. And then this one, and then this one, before settling on this one, with this lowered note again on top that we've heard since the beginning, the introduction of the symphony, recalling, yes, that lifeless, inanimate sound from the introduction, with accents now on the third beat of the measure. 3, 3, and things are teetering, you hear, rhythmically, until the Hemiola kicks in to save the day. And order is restored. Hear how Beethoven delights in throwing everything off balance, ready to slip into chaos, and then with a stroke of his pen, he restores order. Now with more Hemiola, earthbound and heavenly. And that rollicking triad theme closes out the main scherzo. Beethoven, musical master of the universe. Incidentally, this Hemiola device, the quick alternating between rhythmic groups of 2 and 3, it figures prominently in a couple of well-known traditional ethnic dances that are built on this pattern. The Spanish dance, the Polo, alternates between 2 groups of 3, yumpa, yumpa, and 3 quick groups of 2, dumpa, dumpa, bumpa, like so. Anyone who knows the great musical man of La Mancha will recognize this authentic Polo rhythmic pattern. Or in Bernstein's West Side Story, in America, same pattern. Groups of 3 and then followed by a shorter group of 2. That's the Polo rhythm. But there's a famous Czech folk dance, the Furiant, that reverses this pattern. The 3 groups of 2 come first. Then the 2 groups of 3. So we have 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Yes, check out Dvorak's thrilling Furiant scherzo from his 6th symphony. Hemiola that Beethoven used so brilliantly to disrupt his symphonic world has direct parallels to these folk dances of which Beethoven was probably aware, certainly the Czech Furiant. So now, with all of that to ponder, here is the entire main scherzo from Beethoven's 4th Symphony. And now the structural middle of the scherzo, the trio. Beethoven marks it a bit slower than the main scherzo, providing a nice sense of relief from the near chaos we have experienced. And the trio has an unmistakable rustic, nature-like character, and a gentle, graceful woodwind theme, like so, to which the violins respond. These little nature sounds. The woodwinds repeat the tune now, but starting with 2 eighth notes, like so, and the violins will imitate them, like so. And these fleeting nature sounds begin to grow organically. Now again with the lowered G flat, yes, and this fragment now expands into a tranquil stream of sound, almost like the flowing motion of a river, without getting too picturesque here. And the rustic woodwind theme now returns, and we're swept along with this joyous country song, mit Schwung, with hearty swinging motion, and what clearly sounds like the old cuckoo call of the Austrian countryside. Cuckoo, cuckoo, cuckoo. I don't know, it's a descending third. That's what a cuckoo does, right? We'll hear him again, of course, in the Sixth Symphony. That's certainly what it sounds like here. Here is the entire trio. And the entire scherzo proper returns, as is the custom. But Beethoven does something else new and different here. He repeats the scherzo from the top as required, but then he also repeats the entire trio, after which the scherzo proper is heard again. So instead of the traditional three-part structure, scherzo, trio, scherzo, we now have a five-part structure, scherzo, trio, scherzo, trio, scherzo. This may be the first time that this was done in symphonic music. I'll have to check. But Beethoven will now use this expanded five-part structure in all of his future symphonic scherzi. And at the very end, a little surprise, a brief hunting horn call, the rustic horn fifth that we've discussed, bringing yet another fascinating, complex, and revolutionary symphonic movement to an end. And the finale does not disappoint. The level of invention and ingenuity is maintained with a dynamic, perpetual motion. The manic energy never lets up until the very end, and then only for a last-minute salute to Haydn. Again, the dependable sonata form keeps us grounded as this dizzying display of orchestral virtuosity unfolds. And Beethoven, as usual, will build his structure on tiny cells or motifs. He begins immediately with the rapid running passage work that dominates this finale, with this theme, which I will play much slower. And the first four notes, which we speed up, of course, these four notes will serve as Beethoven's main cell of this movement, followed by and then this descending scale, which hurtles downward, and then a decisive cadence without its final chord. And we're off and running. But everything happens very softly now, at a whisper, bustling in the strings, and built on our little motive, until a real theme appears. It's very simple, using the basic tonic and dominant harmonies. Breezy and very gentle until things explode. heard another of the first theme group, also in B flat, and also based on the basic harmonies. And we move into the dominant key of F now, where we hear our secondary themes. The first one, rustic, even though it's taking place at a breakneck pace. And the oboe melody, which is playing this, is accompanied by the clarinet, who plays the familiar triplet pattern that clarinets always play in wind serenades in their low register. This figure. It's always very gentle and very soothing, but here, and this always cracks me up, Beethoven's tempo is so fast that the clarinet figure almost sounds comical, as if the player wants to play expressive, but Beethoven says, no, forget it, just play fast. And there, the theme shifted to the cello and bass. This light syncopated violin figure to keep things intense. And now we have another theme in this second group. It's very good-natured. And the full orchestra cuts in each time. With an unexpected move to F minor now, and shades of the mysterious introduction of the symphony with diminished chords. And the effect of this passage is startling, the pounding tempest. So clearly recalling the gloom and the chaos of the symphony's introduction, and driven by the main cell of this movement. But this tempest is answered by this charming, carefree, cheerful, chirpy passage. Not only is it light and playful, but the violin melody is broken up into tiny two-note fragments played on the rhythmical offbeats for extra added impudence. And in the face of such a dramatic assault from those diminished chords, when we hear this little thing, it's really quite comic. And we've just arrived at our closing theme of the exposition. It's joyous and exuberant. Just reveling in the fun with the main motive dashing over, under, and around us. And you heard the exposition ends with our perpetual motion motive in the strings, while the rest of the orchestra caps it off with a hearty, okay, ready for more? First, let's review and then hear the entire exposition. And it's amazing how much of it is based on simple harmonies. Again, tonic and dominant, as so common in Beethoven. And that's a major part of the music's elemental power. Okay. There's the opening perpetual motion in B flat major with the main motive, okay, and the descending scale. Let's call this A1. Then the second theme, the lyrical one, let's call it A2. Then A3, the vigorous. This moves us to the dominant key of F major for our second theme group. We'll call this B1. This is the oboe, with the crazy clarinet underneath. Okay, then we have B2, leading to the tempest. We'll call this B3, and its sprightly response. And our closing theme, rounding out the exposition with the main motive and so there are the ingredients of a perfectly designed and thrilling exposition. This torrent of energy recedes a bit into the development section, which starts off with the perpetual motion, yes, and its new accompaniment, etc., now in the key of A flat major. And it leads us through a maze of key changes, which I will play slowly for you. There's our motive. Here's the motive. And arriving at a big unison B natural, as harmonically remote as you can get from our home key of B flat major. And then suddenly our A2 theme appears gently in the cellos and basses. And this is followed by a new phrase now. This is new to the development section. A phrase of 6 measures. 2 bars forte, which is loud, and 4 bars piano, which is soft, with a new lyrical motive that's played by the woodwinds. It is this, starting with the 2 forte bars. And it repeats, but our main motive, the perpetual motion, is going continually in the strings. And this 6-bar phrase moves around sequentially in its harmonies as it repeats. And this material forms the major part of the central development section and leads to a lengthy buildup with the main motive continually, perpetually in motion over this rhythm, the one that closed the exposition. And now the incessant rapid motion drops out just for a minute, and the entire orchestra unites on these short chords, very sharp blows built on the dominant 7th chord of F. Which you know will ultimately resolve to our tonic B flat, of course, but for now it's stuck in place, churning away like so. A deluge of orchestral power. And back in the exposition, when we heard this, I mentioned its connection to the murky introduction to the first movement. And now the connection is even more clear, since this is practically a direct quote of this from the introduction. The dominant chord, F dominant chord, with that ominous G flat on top. So Beethoven's uproarious music with this dynamic, unstoppable energy has indeed sprung forth from the inert void with which the symphony began. And that little atom of energy in the finale is once again chained into a continuous stream, leading to the recapitulation, initiated by the bassoon in one of the repertoire's most challenging passages for this instrument. One wonders how the bassoonist in the first performances of this symphony ever coped with this. And the recapitulation, as usual, basically restates the material from the exposition. And the perpetual motion in the violins continues directly into the coda, again supported by this accompaniment. And there are more tempest chords. And the main theme now returns, this time with the clarinet joining the violins. It's very tricky to coordinate this. Then the full orchestra takes over fortissimo, and that rushing downward scale from the main theme, this one, yes, is now hammered by the strings repeatedly. And listen where it leads. He's done it again. This is the fourth symphony in a row. We're close to the end of the symphony. In the finale, there is a big pause, a big fermata, a held note, based on a dominant chord. So here the music grinds to a halt with that big seventh chord, but with the flatted note, the G flat on top, which finally settles here. But again, the same dark tonality from the introduction of this symphony is always present. But the energy and the animation, the life force of this music cannot be stopped. Now it resumes very softly, as if from a distance, the main cell in the cello and bass, over which our A2 theme appears, the lyrical theme. But now a totally new melodic idea is appended to this, recalling the cheerful, bucolic moments of this symphony, but not for long. That lovely new theme. And I imagine some of you have been saying, why does he keep talking about Haydn? Well, after this symphony, the fourth, Haydn's influence on Beethoven begins to decline. But the similarities of Beethoven's breezy, boisterous finale to some of Haydn's sprightly final movements are very significant, especially when we get to the end of some of Haydn's London symphonies, where his legendary wit was often displayed. Haydn had a number of tricks, like starting the main theme and abruptly stopping it and then restarting it, or breaking the theme into little pieces, and the London audiences loved it. In Haydn's great Symphony No. 99, near the very end, the music cadences decisively and triumphantly. And for all we know, the symphony is ended. But after a pause, the orchestra resumes with the main theme, which is this. But at a much slower tempo. All right, almost somber, as if pondering the great philosophical meanings of his merry melody. And nobody knows what's going on until the music then takes off at full speed into the final measures. That's Haydn's Symphony No. 99. Well, here is a live performance of this passage near the end of that symphony. And the conductor in this performance actually made a little theatrical routine out of it. The music cadenced. The music stopped. Conductor put down his baton and started to move off of the podium, but the concertmaster signaled to him like, hey, dummy, come on, finish the piece. And he did. Here's what it sounded like. This was very much in the spirit of what Haydn's audiences expected back in the day. I mention all of this because when Beethoven gets to the same place in his Fourth Symphony finale, the music abruptly stops. He takes the main theme, which has always been very, very fast, and its descending scale, which keeps descending now. Okay, and here's what he does with it. And so, with a clear tip of the hat to his illustrious predecessor, Beethoven concludes his great but underappreciated Fourth Symphony in thrilling fashion. As you step back and you take in the overall span, the structure, the architecture of this symphony, its total effect, something becomes astonishingly clear, I believe. Suppose that Beethoven had started the first movement without the slow introduction. The orchestra tunes, the conductor appears, raises the baton, and the symphony begins. And the rest of the work proceeds exactly as we know it. How would our impression of this symphony differ without the slow introduction? Now, it's always possible that Beethoven was simply writing notes with no meaning or intention beyond them. If he wanted to describe something like nature in his Sixth Symphony, he made it very clear. And I'm not a musicologist or a historian that spends time inventing nifty theories about music. I read the composer's words, I live with the music, and this is very important. I've stood on the podium in front of real live musicians, excellent ones, and experienced the sound moving and vibrating through the space around us, and the way the actual notes shape themselves in the air as they move through time. I know it sounds a bit outré, but it sometimes happens. And occasionally, with certain composers whose music seems to exist in something of an extra musical dimension, some of Beethoven, Debussy for sure, Shostakovich, Mahler, definitely Sibelius. Your instincts as a musician and a composer pick up on certain very strong signals that resonate with the composer's words, or with their life experience, or with their other works in other genres. So there's a middle ground, I believe, between pure abstract music and programmatic music that may be at work in Beethoven's Fourth. His recent more theatrical projects, ballet, oratorio, opera, which certainly had something to do with his writing a Bonaparte symphony, may also have influenced the way in which Beethoven conceived his symphonic music's design, and the way its effect, when brought to life in performance, might parallel the natural world as he saw it. And Beethoven loved nature. He revered its beauty and its mysteries. The Fourth Symphony's connections to Haydn's Symphonies 98 and 102, and by extension, his oratorio, The Creation, Haydn and Beethoven's fascination with the theories of the creation of suns and planets, all of these things are swirling around in the mind of the man who created this Fourth Symphony, which takes us from the inert, desolate cosmos of the introduction, where fragments of matter slowly coalesce, gain in intensity, and are transformed into a brilliant, life-affirming dance. Then a heavenly slow movement, continually animated with flowing, pulsating motion, followed by an uproarious scherzo where rhythm and harmony often teeter on the brink of chaos, and a finale whose incessant manic energy represents a joyous, unstoppable life force. And all of it grew out of the void with which this symphony began. Beethoven's amazing ability to create and harness energy in his music, to concentrate and distill its essence, leads directly to the next work in this series. I'm Lawrence Rapchak, and thank you for listening.